Thank you very much, Sophie. Hello, everybody. Hello to the people online as well. Hope you can hear me. If you can't, make it known and somebody will pick that up, I'm sure, and let me know. So yes, thank you also to the Wildlife Trusts for inviting me along here today to talk about finding your voice, speaking up for nature. So I am currently the Regional Director of Campaigns and Advocacy for Compassion in World Farming. I'm not sure whether anybody here knows of, all the hands shoot up. No, not quite, but still. So yeah, I'm Regional Director for Europe for Compassion in World Farming. But as Sophie mentioned, I used to work for WWF. And just to get the obvious jokes out of the way early on, this is not working. I'm not clicking. Is that it? Sorry, technical error. And it spoiled the joke as well. So this is not my working day. It wasn't that WWF. It's the monochromatic bear WWF with the panda logo. So not the wrestlers. So I worked for them for about 11.5 years in the UK office, but also for the international office, which is based in Switzerland. But before that, I'd actually worked for Amnesty International for about 3 years on campaigns to stop violence against women, which was one of their flagship campaigns, and also on Zimbabwe and growth and mobilization in India. And as I said, now I work in Compassion on World Farming, where we're trying to campaign for a sustainable food system effectively. So Compassion's mission has always been to end factory farming and have the more humane treatment of farm animals. But we're also addressing that now from the point of view of the whole food system globally needs to change to achieve better welfare for animals, but also help address biodiversity loss and climate change impacts. I also worked for about 5 years before I joined Compassion 2 months ago for the Cabinet Office. But as you can imagine, working for the Cabinet Office in the last 5 years, I'm probably not going to say so much about that in this talk. So enough about me. I'm interested in the people here and what you might already be doing to speak up for nature. So we're going to go through a bit here, maybe a little bit of audience participation, hands up, shout outs. So who is already a member of or giving money to organizations like WWF, the Wildlife Trusts, Greenpeace? All the hands do go up this time. Great, good, good. And any of you, so do you write letters? Do you take action? Send emails, all that sort of stuff that they ask you to do? Does anybody consider the environmental impact of, I can see this crowd already, I know you all do, you consider the environmental impact of the things that you buy and the life choices that you make and the places that you go. Has any of the children here taken part in school strike for climate or anything like that? All the children run off, which is good. Okay, so we'll skip that one. And who's met with your MP or an elected representative to talk about environmental issues? Has anybody done that? Do you want to say what the issue was and how it went? You have to shout out because you don't have the mic. Here it comes.
Oh, there we go. Haven't met, but certainly been in a lot of communication with my local MP to raise environmental matters, just saying from a young person's perspective how much it means to us, and to get that message up as far up the democratic food chain, if you like, as we can. So yeah.
Yeah. And did you get a response?
Yeah, got a response from the department minister. I mean, they've all changed around since then.
That's the way it tends to be. The MP will send it up to the minister, who will then send you a response, or they'll send a response on their behalf.
So I got a response from them. It was, nonchalant and very broad and no real actions, but at least it got there. So
all part of the democratic process. Hey?
Indeed. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. So that's another thing we can do, or maybe are doing. Who organises, apart from the obvious people from the Wildlife Trusts, who organises other people to take part in demonstrations, actions? Yeah, there's a few people here. And do people here join marches, demonstrations? Do you show up to say what matters to you. Good stuff. And has anybody thrown orange paint at anything, like a priceless work of art, or have they superglued themselves to the road or a motorway gantry? And the point of all this is that there are a huge range of things that we can all do, and clearly are all doing as well, to speak up for and give a voice to nature. But maybe if this is going to scroll on, I'll ask the question is, why? Why do we need to speak up for nature? Well, the kind of obvious answer, I suppose, is because nature doesn't have its own voice. So I think we have a responsibility actually to look at what's going on in the world around us and to comment on it and to ask for change. And when we look at that question of what's been lost, over the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, as it used to be known, but now just known as WWF, and Zoological Society of London, which are the people behind London Zoo, as I'm sure you know, they do this report every 2 years, and they have been since 1970, where they look at the populations globally of a whole range of land and sea-based species, and they assess from a 1970 baseline whether those populations have been growing and whether they've been declining. They choose what are called in the business as the charismatic megafauna, which is basically big things like gorillas. That's a small gorilla, but even I know that. And lions and elephants and the animals that people are charismatic, so people connect to them and understand that they're sort of important for the ecosystem. But that's why they measure those populations, because the health of those bigger mammals is a good indicator of the health of the whole ecosystem and the habitat in which they live. So I don't know how many people here are familiar with the Living Planet Index, but does anybody want to know, want to take a guess or know whether the index has been increasing or decreasing since 1970? And does anybody want to be really brave and guess by how much? Increasing or decreasing? Decreasing. And anybody want to have a stab at how much it's decreased by since 1970? It's 69%, so nearly 2/3 of populations, indicative populations. This isn't to say that all of nature has declined by 69%, just to be clear, but more than 2/3 of the populations of wild species that kind of indicate the health of nature and of biodiversity have declined since 1970. What I think is also quite frightening to think is that when that green line, the index is 1, when the green line hits 0, that effectively means that the natural world is dead. So we haven't got long to go. So what's causing this? Well, as with many things these days, climate change is a big factor. And the reason that's important for the health of nature and biodiversity generally is that we are all species are adapted to their environment. We as humans, we can insulate homes better, which is something we definitely need to do, and we can adapt to our environment because we have more skills and abilities to do so. But a lot of species just don't have that, and the climate is changing so rapidly that they're unable to adapt as quickly as to be able to survive effectively. So if you think about the iconic polar bear, the sort of the poster animal of climate change, as it often is, it's adapted very well to the Arctic. The Arctic has been warming at between 4 and 5 times the rate of the rest of the planet. So the polar bear's natural ability to blend into its environment and to hunt from sea ice is being changed by thinning of sea ice, its fragmentation, which means that it's harder for the polar bear to hunt for seals as its source of food, and that's leading to decline in the health of polar bears, decline their population. Some polar bears are even known to have died of exhaustion from swimming between ice packs as they hunt. Another thing, of course, is kind of human impacts on the natural world. And I chose this slide, which is a map of all of the, well, it's, 936, that might not be quite up to date, World Heritage sites that there are around the world. And I chose this because I worked on a campaign with WWF to try and prevent oil companies, mining companies, oil and gas extractive companies going into natural World Heritage sites. But it shows here the yellow diamonds are the cultural World Heritage sites. So it's places like the Houses of Parliament and the Forbidden City in China and most of Italy. And then the green ones are the natural World Heritage sites. So they're places like, I wrote some of these down and I've forgotten what they are. The Jurassic Coast is probably one of the closest ones that we've got in the UK, but the Australia's Barrier Reef, Belize's Barrier Reef is around about here, which is the second biggest barrier reef in the world. The Galapagos Islands, all natural World Heritage sites. sites. But the red dots on here represent what's known as the list of World Heritage in danger. World Heritage sites are inscribed on the World Heritage list because they have what's called outstanding universal value to us all. And that's recognized by their inscription on the World Heritage list. Unfortunately, human activities is mainly driving the degradation of those sites, so that I don't know how many there are, but there's 30 or 40 sites now, natural and cultural, which are considered to be at danger and could lose their World Heritage status. And this is just a picture that hopefully indicates a little bit of how that happens. Does anybody want to have a stab at where this is, or where you have the general region, or you can have the city itself? This is Amazonia, yep. So it's Manaus, or part of Manaus in Brazil. So Manaus has had human settlement in it for at least 600 years, and probably well before that, the 600 years since the European settlers moved there and started settling the area. And it's grown in the last probably 30, 40 years to a city of 2.2 million people. But it's also one of the main ports from which the Amazon's natural resources, and you've probably heard a lot of that in the news, and the destruction of the rainforest for wood, but also for other resources, they come out of Manaus and are then exported to the rest of the world. And that, of course, is draining a lot of resources and having a big impact on the biodiversity of the Amazon. And then moving to somewhere else in the world, this is, again, I'm going to see if anybody wants to have a guess. It's a tough one, I suppose, because it could be anywhere, but it's Kalimantan in Indonesia. And I chose this picture because I think it kind of illustrates the human impact on nature. So the top part of the picture there, you've got the wild forest, and in the bottom half, you've got the palm oil plantations. And you might think, well, this is all green, it's all good, surely that greenery is good. And to an extent, greenery is good for things like the albedo effect. Greenery is good. But the problem with this is you can see that from adopting this monoculture of palm oil, you're just massively cutting down on the biodiversity that exists in the natural part of the forest there. So the diversity of species of not just plants and trees, but also of mammals and birds will be greatly reduced in this part where it's been cultivated. And that, of course, has a direct impact on the species that live there. This is a Greenpeace photo from Borneo. And orangutans are having, their habitat is being wiped out by conversion of the land there to palm oil in particular, but also other crops. But it's not just happening sort of far away and over there. I don't want you to get that impression as well. So in the UK, biodiversity is being impacted. I'm sure you all know a fair bit about that. The hedgehog here are chosen because its numbers have declined by around about 30% in urban areas and around about 50% in rural areas since the turn of the millennium. So just in like 23 years, there's been a massive decline in hedgehog populations. And that's because of issues like I've just talked about in Brazil and Indonesia of habitat degradation, habitat fragmentation, but also because of things like farming practices. So connecting to what I work on now with Compassion in World Farming, the use of insecticides, pesticides, and fertilizers is effectively destroying the food sources of things like hedgehogs, but also in some cases poisoning them. There's evidence that some of them are being poisoned by these chemicals that we're applying to the land. Anybody from RSPB in here? Great. Anybody? This species? Turtle dove. 10 points. Yes, turtle doves as well. Similarly, birds, the storm petrel, turtle dove, barn owl, all on the sort of list of threatened species in the UK for, again, similar reasons. The degradation of their habitats, their lack of ability to access food sources. And when you think that 97% of the UK's wildflower meadows that we enjoyed in the 1930s have disappeared since the 1930s, so coming up for 100 years, 97% have gone. Again, think back to the biodiversity of the Kalimantan palm oil and the natural forest, and the biodiversity of this on a different scale. The insects and the small mammals that will have used this as their food source, but also their habitat. And then the bigger mammals and the birds that would have fed on them. By losing this biodiversity, we're losing those species as well. And what's at further risk? Well, it's thought that a quarter of UK mammals, and this little chap's the water vole, I think, a quarter of UK mammals are threatened with extinction. And if you think that there's a similar sort of proportion threatened globally, back to that line that we had earlier with the WWF and ZSL Living Planet Index, we lose those quarter in addition to the quarter of the remaining 31%, then we're in real trouble. But it's not all doom and gloom. And there are things that are being done and can continue to be done. And with the support of people like you supporting organizations that do these things, then we can sort of start to restore nature. The barn owl was in decline, or has been in decline. But I know that I was reading on the Wildlife Trust website that some of the actions that have been taken in certain parts of the country to restore habitats and support barn owls has meant that the decline has at least been sort of halted, and in some cases we're starting to see the restoration of species. And then we've got our largest terrestrial land mammal in the UK, the red deer, is protected now because of the 1991 Deer Act. And this is just to sort of highlight as well how legislation can be a really important tool for protecting nature. I mentioned, well, actually we've not quite got to it yet, but there was a picture earlier in the presentation of a campaign that Sophie and I worked on many years ago now on the first climate change act in the world. So the UK had the first climate change bill, which sought to measure and then aim for targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as you're probably all aware. That was groundbreaking legislation. It's meant a lot for the way that policy has changed in the UK, but it's also been a model that other countries have adopted. So other countries now have climate change acts and targets. So yeah, legislation can have a real part to play. And then I think it's Tala's presentation earlier about insects was interesting, and I have some similar stats. I hope they don't conflict with yours. But yes, the value of nature. I think it's about up to $577 billion globally of global food production can be attributed to pollinators. So yeah, the bees, the butterflies, the moths, wasps, even the services that they provide. So I sometimes have a bit of a problem with equating natural services with their economic value, but it does start to make people sort of realize how much we depend on nature for some of these things. There was something in the news earlier this week about farmers in China having to pollinate their crops using paintbrushes. Think about the scale of the crops that we're going to have to pollinate globally if we move to that, and the human cost. But it's just, for me, it's not even possible. So we have to protect nature to protect ourselves. So yeah, it's kind of then back to what we can do. And I think if you think about not just in the environmental world, but if the suffragettes in the 1920s, or of the civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King in the 60s, the Greenpeace's first protesters against whaling in the 1970s, Greenham Common Women in the 1980s. And yeah, like I said earlier, the campaign that brought about the Climate Change Act and the Committee on Climate Change, more recent campaigns saying that you shouldn't drill for oil and gas in Africa's oldest national park, and the progress that we're finally making, albeit late really, on climate change and reducing global carbon emissions. The thing that's similar about all of these things is that people are behind them, and that's because politicians and decision makers, whether it's politicians or business leaders, they listen to people like you and me. So my call to you is to get involved, to support organizations like Compassionate World Farming, of course I'm going to say that, but the Wildlife Trusts, WWF, Greenpeace, whatever it is that engages you and you value. And I hope for some of the things that we've talked about here, you'll see the value that there is in nature and why we should protect it. Join those organizations, support them, come along to events like this, and thank you all for coming today. But write to your MPs, write to your elected representatives, to business leaders, demonstrate to them through the things that you buy, and how you live your life. There's great things around here as well today about things you can do at home, things you can do in your gardens. Let's just start to, they might seem like really small acts, but together, they do add up, and they demonstrate your commitment, and they do make a difference, they do make a change. So I'd encourage you all to borrow, it's a Gandhi quote, which is always a bit cheesy, but you need to be the change that you want to see in the world. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions, but thank you otherwise for listening, for coming along.
Hello. Perfect. Thank you so much, Owen. That was a really, really interesting talk. We are going to take questions. As I said, I'll read out the ones online in a moment. And if you do have any other questions online, please do continue to send them through. And in the room, does anyone have any questions for Owen? I'll bring the mic over to you if you want to ask anything about all of the things that he's been saying. Great.
Yeah, actually, I was just quite interested in your job. You say compassion in world farming. I was wondering if you'd tell us a bit more about that and what sort of things you do there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So it's an organization that started in 1967 with a Hampshire-based farmer who was pretty shocked at the way that industrial agriculture was being run. And let's face it, it's only really got worse from then. The keeping of animals routinely in cages, things like tail docking of pigs, pregnant sows kept in cages where they can't even stand up or turn around, and then suckling their piglets in those cages. We actually have fairly good standards in the UK as the baseline standards, but as close as France, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, dairy cattle, for example, are routinely tethered, so they can't get outside, they don't have any access to pasture. It's creating huge environmental damage as well from things like slurry and the ammonia that goes into watercourses, nitrates. I mean, I've been learning this week about nitrogen pollution, the nitrogen cycle, so I'm going back to school, but and look up what's happening in the Netherlands at the moment, the political system there. The Netherlands was the first country to embrace industrial agriculture, and it's the first country that's starting to see just how damaging it's been and the problems that it's facing now. It's paralyzing their political system, if nothing else. But Compassion works to end factory farming, and we've got a target of trying to achieve that by 2040. And the way that we think we're going to do that is by transforming to a more sustainable agroecological food system. So putting animals back on the land, their manure then fertilizes the soil, better crops that are used on those pastures, like legumes, things that lock things like nitrogen into those crops. That's a much more sustainable system. And I think factory farming of the agricultural system contributes to around about 30% global greenhouse gas emissions as well. It's also responsible, like we saw with Brazil, clearing of rainforests for pasture land for beef cattle. It's just a driver of all of these issues. So if we can address the food system, we can actually fix a number of these other things as well. So we're sort of working bottom up with improvements on farm animal welfare in the countries that we work in. But then we're also trying to work top down and try and get this global agreement through the UN on a global, more sustainable food system. Does that answer your question?
So much. Does anyone else have any other questions in person in the room? Nobody? Okay, I think we've got a few online actually, so I'll read those out now. Okay, so what are your views about the proliferation of solar farms appearing on farmland?
That's a good question. I hadn't anticipated that one, so well done whoever's online. Yeah, so well, we're facing competing challenges, really, aren't we? I think I don't know actually what sort of regulations there are for where solar farms are erected. I presume that's down to local councils to determine, but we certainly need renewable sources of energy. So if there are locations in the country where you're not losing the use of otherwise productive land and can use that to essentially harvest the energy from the sun and convert that into the energy that we all need, I personally don't have a problem with that. But I would understand if there are concerns about what they look like in the natural environment. I mean, I've heard some really clever things though in, I can't remember where, I think it's maybe Spain for some reason, of elevated solar panels, which allow sheep in particular to then graze underneath them. The solar panel could give shade to the sheep. The sheep graze the pasture. Again, it's back to what I was saying with compassion to farming. We need to get animals back on the land. So you're generating electricity through the solar panels, and you've got the system with the sheep. So yeah, I think it depends. As with many of these things, it depends on location and the appropriateness of something like that to its location. I'm not sure whether that's a good enough answer.
Great, thank you. Well, to me, it sounded good enough, but fabulous. So how important are people's front and back gardens in developing biodiversity?
That's another nice one. So I heard Talia again earlier talking about wildflower meadows, and I had one in my presentation as well. So I've had a little project this summer. Well, actually, it started over in the spring to try and encourage wildflowers into my back garden, which is pretty small. It's barely bigger than that stage, and yeah, I mean, I think that there's kind of like a right way to do it. I did it to sort of just throw some seeds on the thing and hope for the best, and it worked pretty well actually. I've now got a pretty impressive wildflower garden, and I've seen the insects, the butterflies and the bees come back, and they fly into my living room as well, and it's really striking just how much. So even if you've got a small amount of land or a small patch, you can do quite a lot with that. And if everybody's doing that, and I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to convert their gardens to wildflowers, but just introducing a bit more diversity, environmental biodiversity, has an impact. I've seen it at a very small scale, but it doesn't take much to think about. If you multiply that, then it will add up to something, and it just supports wildlife, and it encourages more wildlife elsewhere.
Thank you very much. We've got another question that's just come through as well. Are highways authorities by cutting hedges, etc., in the growing season undermining the Countryside and Wildlife Act?
Bit beyond my technical knowledge of the Highways and Countryside Act. Again, there will be regulations that will send when they should and shouldn't be mowing and cutting and cutting back. Do you know the answer to that? No. Okay, careful, don't put your hand up at the wrong time. You maybe do. Could we get a mic?
The Wildlife Countryside Act of 1981, you should not disturb any known nesting birds. So obviously a lot of our hedgelands at a particular time of the year, which is normally between April and August, have nesting birds in.
Yeah.
And if you're knowledgeable about that happening, and you know that, and then you go and chop it down, you are doing a criminal act, basically.
So that's for like you and me, as well as for
yes,
the question was about
that's
the
for
councils.
anybody
Yeah.
that disturbs knowingly any wildlife that's nesting and or
Thank you.
or resident as it's their home. Yeah.
Would you like to take the next question? No, because that was brilliant. Thank you. I'm glad you were able to answer that, because I wasn't, frankly, but thank you.
Hello. Obviously, given how important agriculture is in affecting biodiversity, is there anything coming in the near future that either gives you massive cause for concern in the UK or massive cause for optimism in how we manage the land? I know there was talk about things like elms, which might have changed how land's managed. So I just wondering if there's anything either way that you thought would have a significant impact on how agriculture is going to affect biodiversity in the UK.
Yeah, thank you. So having left the EU, we're now obviously controlling much more of in more control of the policies that apply to our natural environment in the UK. One thing that the Boris Johnson government committed to when they first came in was the Kept Animals Bill, which again, there are other things as well, but they were quite strong on the environment. And Boris Johnson himself had quite a strong personal commitment to environmental issues. His dad used to be on the environmental committee in the EU. So what we've seen in the last, I think, 2 months was the government has shelved its Kept Animals Bill. So that was something that was going to say end caging of animals in the UK. It was going to ban live exports of animals, and it had a number of other measures that it was going to take. And that's all been dropped for various reasons. It was quite a comprehensive bill. And when you see things like the dominance of the cost of living crisis, and it is important, it is something that politicians need to be engaged in, of course. But if other things just get squeezed out, then I think that's a poor way of going. We've got some hope that there will be a kept animals bill, or at least something that bans cages for animals before the end of this Parliament. And considering there's probably going to be a general election next year, we hope that can get through in time. So yeah, there's some cause for optimism. The thing I've heard quite consistently just on the radio in the last week or two from commentators about climate change is there needs to be a stable political environment for action on climate change. We don't want to see the sort of polarization of that issue as there has been in some other countries. It's already in a way polarized here to an extent, but the reason we got the climate change bill, I think only 3 or 4 MPs opposed it, was because we had that political consensus across the major parties. I hope, on things as important as climate change, restoring biodiversity, and the need to protect nature, we can get more political consensus like that.
Great, thank you so much. Another question? Yeah.
We have learnt that the most 3 effective things that you can do to be effective to have an impact against climate change is number 1, where your pensions go. Number 2, turn to a vegetarian / vegan diet. And number 3 was, oh, it's gone out my head now. Flights. Yeah. No more flying. So what are the 3 most effective things that you can do to actually help with our current situation, with our biodiversity nature crisis in this country, and even what's happening abroad? As an individual that feels overwhelmed, what are the 3 main effective things that we could go out this door and do today and say, right, that's what I'm going to now start doing in my life? That's
a really good question. And I should have said at the beginning of this talk that these are my own views, so I'm not representing any organization here. So what I say, don't take this as, endorsed by Compassion or WWF or anyone. So personally, I don't like to talk in the sort of the extremes. So we all must become vegan, or we all must stop flying, no more flights. I think in simple terms, we all can and maybe should do as much as we can, and that will differ for different people. So looking at taking a sort of a self-critical look at your lifestyle and the things that you can happily do without or change, that's doing something, that's taking action. That's, we should value that. There's a concept, I can't remember who coined the term, it might be George Monbiot, if people are familiar with him, about on the question of cutting down flying, that we should allow what he calls love miles. It's either him or Chris Goodall. So apologies to George Monbiot, not that he'll be watching. But yes, love miles. So some people need to travel to maintain contact with their family. I don't think we should stigmatize them or condemn them for those sorts of things. Similarly, some people choose to be vegan or vegetarian. And yes, the impact of livestock agriculture on the planet is huge, as I was saying earlier. But there are also arguments to say that we actually need meat and meat-based, animal-based protein in our diets. From an evolutionary point of view, we've always eaten those things. So then it comes down to the quantity. If we're eating steaks every day or lots of animal sourced protein in our diets, that's going to be having a bigger environmental impact, and is actually worse for our physical health as well than if we were to cut that down, substitute it with other things that still taste great. They're just not meat, and they won't have as high an environmental impact through their production. So as I said, my sort of simple, more simplistic, slightly less waffly answer to that is to all look at what we can do and do as much as we can, and that we should value that.
Thank you very much. Is that all of our questions? We've got another one over here.
What's your opinion of the government's new biodiversity net gain policy?
I have to confess that even though I worked in the Cabinet Office, that wasn't my area of expertise, and I'm still catching up a little bit on UK environmental policy since having worked on I haven't actually worked on UK environmental policy for about 10, 15 years now. So I'm not really up to speed on that, I have to confess. Sorry.
No worries.
Any other questions? Nothing online?
No.
He says, hopefully.
Hello. Is there anything online, or are we all good? Are there any other questions in here?
Thank you for the questions online.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, then I think we just need to say a massive thank you to Owen for answering our questions and for talking to us today.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for coming, Owen. And if you do have any kind of questions that you just want to speak to Owen about and ask him at the end of this, then I'm sure he'll be available and happy to talk to you. There were also 2 other talks happening today. So one was this morning and one is at 3 o'clock. If you sign up to our email journey, we will send you all of the reading lists, the recommended readings from these talks. And we will also send you the recordings of this talk, the one this morning and the one this afternoon as well. So you can watch them in your own time, as well as some other information. So if you'd like to sign up to that, you can talk to Esther here at the kind of front desk area, and she'll be able to do that for you. And before you leave, there is so much stuff upstairs. You might have already been up there, but if you haven't, please do go check it out. We've got some really cool like VR headsets where you can do this virtual tour of the Surrey Hills, which is amazing. Loads of other really cool organizations, loads of activities, games for children, craft activities, like research as well, like scientific research from the university. So please go check it out if you haven't already. Spend as much time as you want at this event, and please do make a pledge for nature on your way out. If you make your pledge and put it on the tree, then you'll be able to pick up some free wildflower seed bombs to scatter on your lawns. So definitely worth doing, I think. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, everyone. All right, have a lovely afternoon.